Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. So thankful that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to join us for this period of studying the Word of God, of factoring the truth into our daily lives. And you know, Paul, I was looking over 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and there's going to be a good bit of information that we can factor into our lives today.
Yes, I think that's so important, John. I agree with you, and that's that we don't just study the Word of God as some kind of theory or some kind of academic study, but that we are looking for how we can make our lives be what that Word says that we ought to be.
Exactly. Is your day going well, Paul?
It is. Having a good day today, and happy to be part of a noontime, that's Eastern time, Bible study.
Very good. Tom, I want you to know our weather's still good, so I'm not yet jealous of you in California just yet. Are you doing okay today out there?
Oh yeah, we're doing well. We're doing well out here. Actually, cooler than it could be. It's just feel free in Texas and Oklahoma to send us whatever water you have. We'll be glad to take it.
I wish we could do that. I was thinking about that the other day. You know, why not create some huge canal, you know, to send the water out your direction? But we'd probably upset somebody or dislocate some endangered species in doing that.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking more of a pipe.
That would work. Seth, we're missing the son of Kojak today. So Eric is away traveling, and he's on his way back home, from what I understand. So, Seth, how are you getting along there in Florida?
Going well in Florida. Days are numbered before I move up to Tennessee again, but everything's going well down here right now.
Now, where you'll be moving to? Will you be going to the Central Time or still on the Eastern Time?
I'll be in Central Time.
Okay, I couldn't remember the limits there in Tennessee.
Nashville area Central. So.
Okay, all right. And setting in for Eric today, we have Heath Robertson of Birmingham, Alabama. Heath, I'm so thankful that you're able to join us today. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for inviting me to be along for the study. As you said, I'm here in Birmingham, Alabama. I work with the Edwards Lake Church of Christ, and just looking forward to being part of the study today.
Well, I'm glad you could join us. You were part of our through the chat room, our Psalms 22 study, and I found that study to be very interesting. Probably not as thorough as we could have been had we allotted the appropriate time for it, but it still made for an interesting study nonetheless. So thank you for joining us, Heath. And our study is really straightforward. As everyone who's joined us before is aware, we simply walk through the chapter, in this case 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and we look at the basic lessons therein, sometimes a little bit deeper, but mainly seeing how it factors within our lives as Christians, within our lives as children of God. Now, if you are joining us for the first time, please do sign into the chat room. Just using the guest option will be fine, and that way any questions or comments you have, you can share them with us.
All right, John, I was going to tell you just as a matter of further introduction for Heath, is that he spent a significant amount of time preaching in the Netherlands. He lived there for a period of time. I don't know how long it was, but
Norway, actually.
Oh, I apologize.
People
my world geography is not my strong suit. Norway, apologize.
All right, that's interesting because my dad, when I was very young, spent 5 years in Norway.
Yes, I've had some conversations with your dad. We were in the same city.
Oh, Stavanger or Bergen?
Bergen.
Very good.
I
was too young to remember that, but...
I thought you looked a little bit Norwegian, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Well, someone who was clearly not Norwegian was the Apostle Paul, and he composed the letter that we are currently studying through, so we're going to pick up there this morning. And what we're going to do is start with chapter 2, verse 1. As we mentioned at the start of our study, there is a good bit of information within chapter 2, which for us today as Christians, one, it gives us hope that discipline can work. It also gives us instructions on how we are supposed to behave regarding sin, how we should even, if you would, feel about sin within the camp, and what we should do if someone repents and turns away from that sin. So a lot of very, very meaningful information within this chapter and really a good insight into the Apostle Paul. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start reading. And what we'll do, before I do mention that, before we start reading, Paul, did you mention earlier about the online notes?
I did not. First of all, if you'd like to join us as part of this discussion, you can log into the chat. Below the chat window, there's a word that says guest, and you can just click that and type your name in and go for it. Mm-hmm. And it should allow you to make comments and questions, ask questions as part of our study. Also, I believe on the main Truth Factor page, there is a link to a study guide for 2 Corinthians chapter 2. And that'll have some of our own notes there that we'll be looking at today.
Exactly. And and I think I've explained this before. We use Google Docs and we share it's basically an outline containing the verses from the given chapter, and then we go and put in our own thoughts and comments in between the verses, and we'll typically pick a color. And then what I'll do is I'll then transfer the added notes to the notes that we share on our live or on the Live Truth Factor website. So feel free to follow along with that if you'd like to. We don't always follow it word for word. Sometimes we deviate. Some things we can't bring in because of time. Others we add that's not in the notes itself.
I think it would be more accurate to say occasionally we follow it.
Okay. That's a good point. It's just general direction if you want to follow. Just kind of heading that way there. Exactly. First star to the right and on till morning type thing there. Well, Heath, would you mind reading for us, beginning there in verse 1, and let's read through verse 4, and just let Seth know what translation you're reading from.
Okay, I'll be reading from the New American Standard. But I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. For if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one whom I made sorrowful? This is the very thing I wrote to you, so that when I came, I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all that my joy would be the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you.
All right, thank you, Heath. Now, Seth, do you think his statement here, when he says, but I determined this within myself that I would not come again to you in sorrow, is kind of a look back or connected with his statement in chapter 1, verse 23, just a few verses earlier, where it says, moreover, I call God as witness against my soul that to spare you I came no more to Corinth?
I would think so. This is one of the reasons why he's delayed his coming. Another reason is to avoid this sorrow and to give them more time to fix the mistakes they needed to fix.
Okay. But what is interesting about this is that this is almost an allusion back to the purpose for writing the first letter. Instead of going to them first in person, he writes what for us would be the first letter. Any thoughts or comments about that? Do you think that would probably be the way to look at it? Not so much as I'm writing this so I don't have to, but I'm able to come to you now because of the change that you made from the first letter.
I think that's right, John. But there's been some criticism, we think, concerning Paul, of his not doing what he said he had planned to do, coming to them right away. And back in the previous chapter, he says, to spare you, I came no more to Corinth. And I do think that he's making a comment on that, that there was a reason. It wasn't just totally circumstantial, but it was a determination. And while they may have been critical of that, he's saying that it was for their benefit to give them some time to make some more of these changes so that when he came, they could progress forward instead of having a negative experience.
Okay.
Right.
I think we talked about this. Or go ahead, Tom.
No, I was just going to real quickly just make the observation, if there's people new that are listening later on or whatever, remember the chapter divisions were put there by man. So I mean, and this might be an instance of that where if they moved it down a couple of verses, it might help. But
it is interesting to do a study of the chapter divisions, and if I remember correctly, there were probably 4 or 5 variations that were presented. Help me out here. Probably about the 10th, 11th century, somewhere in there, maybe a little bit later. And the one that we have is, of course, is the one that was centered upon, or settled upon. So you're right about that. They're added by man, not by the inspired writers. Yeah. So, and I think we mentioned this last week too. Anytime there is a problem, and in this case in point, sin within the camp, if Paul could get this settled via a letter, then it would make his visit with them much more productive into another area. First off, if there's going to be anger at the messenger, let's go ahead and get that out of the way with a letter, and then when he's there, things will be better off. And sure enough, we know, as we'll continue reading here, that worked, that they listened to the instructions found within the first letter almost too well in regards to this very specific subject here.
I'd be interested in hearing what you gentlemen, in terms of your approach to preaching, that here Paul does not have as a goal to come to them in sorrow. Now, Paul has said on other occasions, like with the Ephesian elders, he's declared the whole counsel of God. He's not going to hold back. I believe it was the Galatians, I could be wrong about that he said that they would not tolerate the false teaching, not even for an hour. But Paul's goal was not to make them sorry. I think sometimes, as preachers, we have to be careful. We don't kind of take some kind of joy in, for lack of a better term, hammering on people. Paul didn't want to hammer them. He wanted to instruct them. He wanted them to make the right changes. He wanted that to be a joyful experience, and that was the kind of relationship he wanted to have with the local church. Would you agree that, from a practical standpoint, that while we always have to be willing to correct error, we always have to be willing to condemn things that are wrong, that our goal ought to be not just to heap sorrow on people because we have the bully pulpit.
Right. Absolutely. We want to, and what I see in Paul, to teach and encourage. That's always the direction. I've always said in the 2 Timothy 4 too. You hear somebody will say, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort. I've heard those say that means that our preaching should be 2/3 negative and 1/3 positive. I do not believe that's what that text is saying. I think Paul is describing a process. Sometimes the process involves tearing down, but the ultimate goal is the exhorting. The ultimate goal is the building up, and when you tear down, it's so that you can build up in its place that which belongs there. So I even make the point that when you're rebuking people, if it's with a right attitude, and if the people that are listening have a right attitude, even that's positive. That's all Paul wants. He wants these brethren to do the right thing. He's one to encourage them. That's why he writes his letters.
That's a good point, Tom. Heath, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, part of the thing that factors in here is the time. He's under criticism because he didn't come when he originally said that he was going to come. Well, he could have come when he left there, but I think he indicates he had just made a quick trip that's not mentioned in Acts that ended in sorrow. I think that's what 2 and verse 1 indicates. And so, sure, I could have come now, but what would have ended up? It would have been just like the last time, because I was just here, we just talked about this, and you need some time to chew on the things that I talked to you about and the things that I wrote you about. And sometimes we think we have to press a matter and press a matter and press a matter until it comes to some kind of a conclusion. But often we just need to let something lay for a little bit and let someone think about it.
I think that's a good point. That's a very good point. I've seen too many preachers and Christians in my life look at you on a point they disagree, and they expect to be able to see, here's the evidence, now change. What do you think about it? Without giving you time to digest the information and to study on it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and if you know of any preacher worth his salt who has been around for a while, he will tell you very quickly, you don't change something immediately.
That's
you
true.
you always digest it. You have to consider it.
That's exactly right.
Here in verse 2, I wanted to take a look just for a second at this idea of going from sorrow to gladness. That here Paul fully admits, I made you sorrow, but the end is gladness. That the end of this repentance, the end is joy. So the ends absolutely justify the means when it comes to this type of route that Paul takes.
Well, let's go ahead and shift then into verse 2 there for just a moment, Seth. As you bring that out there, look at the English Standard Version for just a moment. There's not much variation between that and the New King James, but it does say, "For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained?" Paul, something came to mind earlier when you were talking. So, are you telling me you don't find joy in people seeing people weep during your sermons?
No.
Okay.
No, I find joy if there is a person who needs to make correction,
Mm-hmm.
and they do that with tears. That is godly sorrow.
Right.
That is producing repentance, and that is something that I that when there's a hard topic to teach on, I teach plainly and loudly and boldly. I do my best to do that, but I do that when that's needed. But I would rather be able to give words of instruction for those to be received, and for all of us. I don't mean I'm telling everyone else, starting with me, for all of us to take those things, apply them, and for there not to need to be that more harsh approach. But when the harsh approach is necessary,
Sure.
we need to not shy away from that either.
Well, what brought that to mind, and I said that somewhat in jest there when you made the comment about you're not going to hammer and hammer and hammer. You teach the truth, and as Heath pointed out, you've got to let it set. You've got to let it germinate within the hearts. You need to let them think about it, and it's not about seeing how many people we can upset, how many people we can make cry during the sermon. It's about teaching the truth. If there's a problem, then we teach the truth to correct the problem, and if that causes a person to sorrow, and the end result is their repentance, then that's a good thing. And when we look here at verse 2, Paul says, "For if I make you sorrowful, or if I cause you pain, then who is he who makes me glad but the one who is made sorrowful by me?" Now, my take on that is that an individual, in this case in point, the man who had taken his father's wife, as well as the people that, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, were puffed up in their toleration of this, these individuals would have felt pain, discomfort, or sorrow at Paul's teaching, because he would have been identifying their sin and pointing their sin out. And I really think it's within that scope there that he says, "Then who is he who makes me glad but the one who," and he doesn't say it this way, but the end result is the one who repents. Paul's joy is going to come from those who are in pain because of the teaching, repenting, and turning back to the truth. What do you think, Tom? Do you think that might be the way of looking at that verse?
Yes. Yeah, I definitely see it that way. So.
All right. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know that we can say for absolute certain that it's the guy from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. It is most likely him. It could have been some other problem that he encountered, because he did visit Corinth once, right? Between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians.
Probably.
So it very well could be some other person in there. But I think there's a point to that there that Paul doesn't go into any time talking about who the offender is, what the offender did, or again dragging the guy's name through the mud, going over and over all the terrible things that had been in this guy's past. It's something that's past, and they're moving on. instead of dwelling on something that's already been taken care of.
Okay. Any thoughts or comments about that, Heath? You got anything to add to that?
No, and he's going to specifically talk about the issue of someone that's been in sin in a couple of verses, but that seems to be just one element of what's going on here. He's got these critics coming at him from various angles, and I think their view on dealing with sin is just one difference in their views and Paul's views. And so part of the pain that's going on here is a rejection of Paul as in his teachings, and latching on to these super apostles, he'll later call them.
Okay. All right. So in other words, what you're suggesting here is some of the sorrow that they're experiencing goes beyond the immediate reference to whoever it was that was called in sin. We assume the guy from 1 Corinthians 5. But more than that, but other problems that may have existed, including their attitude towards Paul himself.
Right.
Okay. That makes... I could see that definitely. Because, and that's... Here in a minute, he's going to identify the one that, repents. The punishment is sufficient. So it really brings it down to focusing on him. But we can't forget that there were a lot of problems with the church at Corinth as seen within the first book. And so it would stand to reason that there's more involved than simply that one situation, but other issues as well.
Isn't that a general principle that he states in verse 2, that if I make you sorrowful, who is he who makes me glad? The one who is made sorrowful by me. It makes us glad when we see people changing their lives to be what God says they ought to be.
Exactly.
That's whatever the sin, whatever the struggle, whatever the growth that needs to take place. You're willing to do that hard thing, just like a surgeon's willing to cut on you. That's sort of a negative thing in my view, but he's willing to cut on you to make you better. Paul's willing to cause them pain, as you mentioned in the ESV, or bring sorrow into their life, so that ultimately they can be better, and there's rejoicing because of that.
Right. That's right. Now, this is not the greatest of examples, but sometimes with feet issues, there is a problem called plantar fasciitis, something other like that. And it has to do with the muscle on the bottom of your feet tearing and then repairing, and then you re-tear it. And there are ways that you can go about tending to that to make it stronger, but there is some pain in that process. And you think about someone who's having to go through rehabilitation for whatever reason, the pain and discomfort, and you don't stand back and be joyful because they're experiencing pain and discomfort. The joy is found in their becoming stronger and becoming more fit. So they work through that. So Paul's not rejoicing. He only rejoices in their sorrow singularly, if you would, because it means that they have repented and they've changed. That's a good point, Paul. Sorry about getting into the foot area there. I think I could have probably found a better example than that. But let's go ahead and look at verse 3. So he says, I wrote this very thing to you, lest when I came I should have sorrow over those from whom I ought to have joy, having confidence in you all that my joy is the joy with you all. And so he expresses here his concern that had he came to them before writing what we assume to be, what I assume to be the first letter, okay, and had he gone to them without writing this, then he would have had to spend his time there with them in sorrow, and he would have felt sorrow when he encountered the situation. And so he writes this very thing so that when he is there, he can have joy with them. Is that a reasonable summation, or do you think we should view this a little bit differently? Anyone?
Yeah, I can kind of understand that anything that you can do to diffuse the situation before you get there is a good thing, and I just think that that's the point. The face-to-face confrontations, they have a purpose, but a lot of times the writing and the communication leading up to that also has a purpose, and if it can prevent the heated animosity that sometimes happens from misunderstanding what somebody says or impugning their motives, as you mentioned earlier on, if you can prevent that, then it's what you need to do.
Right. Right. Any other thoughts?
I was thinking about the real tragedy is when you have to send things maybe in writing or deliver them in person that are really hard for the person to receive. I'll say it's to me. Someone tells me something I really need to hear, and it's really hard for me to receive, and it causes me pain, but then I don't change.
Yeah.
That is kind of the sorrow upon sorrow. That's well, here's we went through this exercise of a very difficult situation, and then there's been no improvement. And Paul's trying to avoid that situation, and so when there is harsh or hard teaching that brings guilt maybe into someone's life, they change, they repent of that, they do better. Here's a great thing. But when that happens and there's no change, I don't see a need for me to do anything any differently than what I've been doing. That's frustration.
Okay. All right. Heath, would you want to say something?
Paul, they were already making some accusations against Paul, evident in 1 Corinthians. He knew the kind of attitudes that were developing against him. So I think one of the things we see in his decision to write a letter instead of come is he had to make a choice between, okay, I know that if I don't come exactly when I said I came, there's going to be some people there that are going to say things about me. They're going to accuse me of different things. But he said, if I do come, it's not going to bring any fruit. We're just going to be involved in pain. So I think one of the things we see Paul doing is sacrificing himself, knowing that he is going to be criticized for this choice, but he does it because he believes that's what's best for the people.
As far as in choosing not to go at that moment, but to write the letter instead?
Right.
I could see that. He opens himself up to criticism, but it's the better choice for the brethren to deal with things this way.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Go ahead, Seth.
We have something similar to this when we have the example of our Lord when he's talking to the what we call the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19. Jesus said, if you would be perfect, go sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. And when the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And then Jesus goes on to say, truly only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. I wonder who was more sorrowful and who was more disappointed that day, if it was Jesus or if it was the man who went away sorrowful. Here Paul decides to absolutely do the right thing out of love for the brethren. Who wouldn't want to have someone like the rich young ruler as a member of their congregation with everything that he brings, everything that he has to offer, all the great things that he's done. But if you're not willing to be like Paul and say the difficult thing to someone that you love, then do you truly love them? That's the question.
That's a good point. I mean, how many circumstances have we all had where we look back and say, I should have said something, and for whatever reason I did not? I mean, Barnabas should have said to Peter, your hypocrisy is showing. You need to get a backbone and stand up to these Jews of the circumcision. But he didn't, Just an example there. Go ahead.
And I mean, I've seen the example personally just in the short time that I've been preaching, where especially in families, everyone in the family knows that this certain kid is doing something very, very wrong. but instead of being their parent, they're more interested in having that relationship with them. And instead of doing what's right and following what 1 Corinthians 5 says, they decide that God's way isn't going to work for them and their family, and they love their family member too much to do what God has to say, and it's one of the saddest circumstances, and it really is the selfish thing to do when you don't warn your relation about the danger that they're in.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I know of a situation years ago of an affair that had taken place. And when it finally came to light, there were individuals who said, yeah, we knew about it. We saw him sneak into her house behind this business on a number of occasions. You know, why not confront it? You know, if you really care for their souls, you confront the situation in hopes to get them to change. And this is a good segue into verse 4, because we see within the Apostle Paul the proper attitude towards the brethren. It's an attitude that we should have. You know, the situation there, and you think about it, listen, I've been focusing a lot on the man that they had to discipline in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, but it's been already pointed out several times, there were many other issues there, and they're, you know, listening to what people were saying about Paul and jumping on the anti-Paul bandwagon, you might say. And all of this situation created within themselves a state of spiritual being, if you would, that for Paul caused affliction and caused anguish. And as he says there in verse 4, with many tears. It says something about the Apostle Paul when he is moved to this level of emotional, it's an emotional response, but it is a response based on how he felt for their souls and his love for them.
He cared.
He cared. Exactly. Well, let's go ahead and look at verse 4, and then we'll continue with the discussion here. And by the way, chat room, I would like to thank you for being very quiet, but I don't want to. We don't want you to be quiet. We'd like for you to participate in the study. Now, I do. Oh, Carl, I'm sorry, Carl. I didn't look down in time to see what you put there. We'll bring that into our study. Someone who normally comments a good bit in the chat room is away from his computer today, so he's not able to be there. And so let's go ahead and bring up Carl's comments. And Paul, would you mind, once I get that shared, bringing that into the study, please?
Be happy to do that. Carl Ford says, let me lock that on. Verse 4 kind of states that is the reason that he did not come. He wanted the letter to show his love toward them because he was very troubled to have to write in a stern manner, almost like my father always told me before he gave me a whipping, this is going to hurt me more than it is you. By the way, Carl, I wouldn't be so sure. Paul's hope was that the letter would cause them to want to change before he came, so that while he was there, they could have a more joyful occasion. I was joking about the hurt me more than it's going to hurt you, but I think that is right. Paul does not take any joy in the things that he has to do, but he is interested in helping them to be all that God wants them to be. And I just think that's a great point for us today in this trying to factor in. You know, if you've preached for very long and you've not shed a few tears or lost some sleep, if you've not been sick to your stomach over some problem that you're having to deal with, well, I'll just say that's not my experience. When there are things that you see people doing and you want them to learn better and to change, or maybe you see it in your own life that you need to do some things, you need to improve, and you need to do some changing, and sometimes that can be very, I'm not saying we have an emotion-based religion, but it can bring out the sincerity of our emotions in our response to the word being preached.
All right. It's a good point. Good point. Any other thoughts or comments on what Paul was saying there?
Right. You know, Paul says it's not an emotion-based religion, but you can't preach without emotion. Or I mean, that's the interesting observation about that. You know, it's not emotionally based, but we need emotion. I mean, emotion properly developed is good.
Tom, I think that's a great point. I think when we view preaching as an academic lecture, strictly to impart information, we are not preaching the kind of message that they preached in New Testament times. We're not doing Bible preaching. Bible preaching not only imparts the truth, but it urges obedience to that truth.
Right.
I think something that maybe we may face, and maybe it is new to the last 200 years, I'm not real certain, but preaching has become an occupation. You think about it. It is one job choice out of 1,000, and it is something that you can do, and you do your work every week. You preach on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. Hey, it's your job. It's your occupation. And I suspect that if that is why a preacher is preaching and nothing more, then I agree with what you're saying, Paul. He's missing something very vital. There's got to be a desire for souls to be saved that causes one to want to proclaim the word and to edify brethren and to bring the lost to the Lord. Any thoughts? All right. So, Heath, when we're looking here at verse 4, he talks about his feelings, if you would, regarding their situation. But notice there he says that not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have so abundantly for you. It sounds like here that Paul's motive for writing to them was love.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of in line with some of the comments that we've made, I've heard some preachers have this attitude, and someone relayed to me a story about a preacher who commented about another preacher's close relationship with his members, and he says, you know, you've really got to cut that out. I try to stay as far away from the members as I can so that I don't have any reason not to say what I need to say. But the problem is he can say what he needs to say all he wants, but the old saying is nobody cares what you have to say, and nobody cares what you know until they know that you care.
That's a good point.
I think that's Paul's point here. They needed to know, you know, I'm doing this because I love you so much.
Why should someone listen to you if they don't feel like you're invested in them? You know, that's a
What
very
would have
good
been
point.
easier for Paul to do? If he didn't care if they were saved or they were lost, if he didn't care that they stood right before God and made these corrections that were needed to be made, if he didn't love them enough to say the hard things, he keeps his mouth shut and says, "Who cares?"
That's right.
So, but because he loved them, you know, he had to bring forth that message.
Seth, and I noticed there in the notes there, you've added a very good point about what true love will seek.
Certainly.
Now go ahead and explain that.
Oh, sure. I mean, if you have a friend, coworker, cousin, child, or spouse that's living in blatant sin, and if you truly love them, what would you do for them?
Right.
If someone comes to your door and they need water and they're dying of thirst and you've got an endless supply from your tap, you would be hateful if you didn't give them the water that would save their life. We have the gospel. Withholding that from people is a hateful thing to do. Just because we're afraid of losing them as a friend or becoming estranged from them, they'll kick us out of the family, or they'll leave us and not talk to us anymore. Those types of fears are completely unwarranted. I mean, if you truly love them, you'll seek what's best for their soul.
Well, I should someone listen to you if they don't feel like you're invested in them. You know, that's a very good point.
If you truly love them, you'll seek what's best for their soul. I mean, if you truly love them, you'll seek what's best for their soul.
That's right. That's exactly right. We've got another comment from Carl in the chat room. Paul, let me bring that up, and if you'd like to bring that in. Carl continues when he says, to John's point, I think is where we need to pick up with.
Okay.
Let me get that here.
To John's point about some who witnessed seeing the one who was sneaking in to have the affair, Satan knows it is difficult to face people, and he counts on us failing the test of doing what the Lord wants us to do by confronting our brethren, thereby causing others to sin by not confronting those acting out sin. We must learn that our love for our brethren is put to the test in this manner. I think our biggest challenge is not being overcome by social pressures to mind our own business when we see sin. We are lights and salt. We must act, or we are salt that has lost its savor, or a light hidden under a bushel. Jesus cares. That is why he commands us to love our brothers. That is how the world will know we belong to the Lord. And those are all good comments, Carl. I appreciate those. And when you look at those kind of statements, you realize that the heavy weight of the responsibility that Paul felt toward these Christians.
It's interesting that Carl, the comment that you made regarding Satan using it as an opportunity, when we refuse to confront it, and then with some of the issues that we've been talking about that they were facing, in addition to not having confronted the brother initially, it makes me wonder about Paul's point, and we'll talk about this later in verses 10 and 11, where it says, For I have forgiven that one for your sakes in the presence of Christ, lest Satan should take advantage of us, for we're not ignorant of his devices. And I realize in the context here, he may be focused on one or two specific devices, if you would, but in general, the point that you make there, Carl, is just right on target with the reason why we have to be so concerned about this. So I appreciate that. All right, any other thoughts or comments? Okay. Well, let's go ahead. What do you think? Move on then to verse 5, and let's kind of get into the situation, what had into that which had resulted from their obedience finally to the Scriptures.
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
Yeah. One more real quick observation. In verse 3, Paul says, having confidence in you all that my joy is the joy of you all. I think it's interesting how Paul is confident. I this past couple of weeks I've been preaching sermons on optimism, a proper view of optimism as well as pessimism and so on. And here Paul demonstrates he's confident in these brethren, and I noticed he does that several times in most of his letters. In other words, he's approaching them. I know you're going to change. I know you want to do what's right. And I think that's an attitude we need as we approach others. We don't need to go to them expecting failure. Right. We go to them expecting success. Maybe prepared for failure, but we expect success.
I think that's a really important point, because think about Paul's history with the Corinthians and what he knows about them. If we knew those people, we may say, well, I can't have confidence those people are going to change. But Paul believed in the power of the gospel. He believed that bringing them back to focus on what they need to do could bring them in unity, could eliminate this sin. And so he was able to express confidence in areas where we couldn't without the power of God.
As preachers, there's the danger, and I think Heath states it pretty well, very well, that we can become cynical, and we can have had some bad experiences with brethren, and instead of being like Paul's had some bad experiences with brethren, he's been in perils of brethren, but instead of focusing on that, he focuses on, I know you can do this. I know you can overcome this. You can be strong.
That's a good point. Good point. And I think there's a lot more we could say about that, but we'd end up repeating a very good point already well made. But it is so true. So true. Well, let's start reading there. And Seth, would you mind, since you've got the sharing job today, read for us verses 5 through 11?
For sure. It says, "Now if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but in some measure, not to put it too severely, to all of you. For such a one, this punishment by the majority is enough. So you should rather turn to forgive and comfort him, or he may be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. So I beg you to reaffirm your love for him. For this is why I wrote, that I might test you and know whether you are obedient in everything. Anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. Indeed, what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, has been for your sake in the presence of Christ, so that we would not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs."
All right. Thank you, Seth. I like the English Standard Version's rendering of a couple different things here within this particular text, and we'll bring them out as we go through this. But notice there in verse 5 that he makes the point, "But if anyone has caused grief, he has not grieved me, but all of you to some extent, not to be too severe." I had to look at this particular verse in 3 different translations. I looked at it in the New King James, the ESV, and the New American Standard Version. And I think the English Standard Version rendering seems to be a little bit more understandable when he says, "He has caused it not to me, but in some measure, not to put it too severely, to all of you." That seems to be a statement, maybe a descriptive statement about what he is saying. He's not trying to make it too severe, but the reality is this individual that has caused grief, he's not caused grief for me, Paul says, but he's caused it for you. And you think about it, whatever the specific situation is, whether it be the man who had taken his father's wife or maybe some other situation, either way, that individual has caused grief for the whole of the congregation. Any thoughts or any comments on that?
Let me look at this situation, and what is Paul getting so upset about? He's worried about how this situation is going to affect him. He's worried about, did I not do a good enough job? I don't know what they were thinking, but
Yeah.
He's saying to Corinthians, no, I'm upset because I know how tolerating sin is affecting you. And as he said in 1 Corinthians 5, how a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And he knows where this is going to go if it isn't dealt with right here and now.
That's right. Heath, it reminds me of back when we were looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul talks about the foundation that he had laid when he preached there in Corinth. And we had a little bit different viewpoints on Paul's statement regarding those who would defile the well, let me turn back to it because I'm about to mess the whole thing up. There in verse 3 where he was talking about the verse 16, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." The way that some of us were kind of looking at that is that he was talking about the local congregation there that had been established, that had been built up, and he's encouraging them not to let anyone to defile that temple or defile that work that had been done. It really sounds like, if that is an accurate understanding of that's the very thing that you're talking about that has taken place and that he's having to deal with here. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think Paul views in various verses, depending on what he's talking about, I think he talks about the individual Christian as the temple. And here in 1 Corinthians 3, the local congregation as the temple. In Ephesians 2, the universal church as the temple. And with that focus in mind, is that at whatever level, whether we are sinning as individuals, whether we're causing division in the local church, which in and of itself affects the universal church, he's saying this is a dangerous thing. not only to what you're doing to yourselves, but what you're willing to do to the house of God.
Exactly.
You know,
Any other thoughts?
it's really difficult to stand up against someone that you know that is in sin, but how much more difficult is it for an entire group to unify together to, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5, to deliver such a one to Satan, to actually go through the steps of discipline and not and you know, if we say that Paul was essentially saying this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, to have an entire congregation being willing to do that for a brother that they love, a brother that they care about, someone that's a part of their family, but an entire congregation going through the steps of discipline for someone that they care about is a challenging thing to do, but it's one that Paul sees as absolutely necessary, something that we should be willing to do. Much of their sorrow was caused by one man. One guy caused all of the sorrow, but now it's been everyone has been made sorrowful by this one guy, and now it's time to let bygones be bygones and forget the hurt that that one guy has caused and welcome him back completely and wholly.
Yeah.
John, as I was looking at this, you know, they could have said, Paul, you're the one causing grief, or whatever. But Paul says that did not cause me grief. It's been this problem has caused the whole group grief, and it reminded me back in 1 Kings chapter 18. Remember the exchange between Ahab and Elijah, and Ahab, he says, "Is that you, troubler of Israel, the one who's always troubling us, causing us problems?" And sometimes the one who teaches the truth here, he's called the troubler. But in reality, the person who was living in sin and those who were puffed up on his behalf, they were the ones who were the troublers.
That's right. That's exactly right. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on that? I think very good points made. Let's see, we've got about 5 minutes left in our study. We can go a little bit farther with this. Look there at verse 6. Again, we keep throwing this, or I keep throwing this back to being the man that had taken his father's wife in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul's instructions there, and said you had looked at that, or comment referred to that as well. But he says that this punishment which was inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man. It suggests strongly here, or I guess I should say is inferred in this text, that it worked. That what they followed Paul's instructions a little bit too well, and we'll talk about that, but it worked. Which tells us the whole process of discipline today, if it's done properly, in the proper spirit, and observed properly by the brethren, that it too can work as well. All right, any thoughts? I'm hearing that echo too, Seth. I'm trying to figure out. Sometimes the echo is bad enough we can actually see it metering on the individual overlays there, but
I think it's been corrected. I think someone plugged in headphones and that's taking care of the problem.
Because if we hear the echoing, then the folks at home hear the echoing as well. So, yeah. Any thoughts or comments about this? Not about the echo, unless you want to echo something that I just said.
We do have, before we close out today, John, Carl had a couple more comments in the chat.
All right, let me bring that up here. Where do you want to begin at, Paul?
I think it's, I lost track.
Based on the timestamp, did we stop? He says, I think our biggest challenge is not being overcome by social pressures. We
read that one, yes.
All right, well, let's start with Jesus cares, and that way if we overlap, it's good to hear again that Jesus cares.
Okay. Let me lock on here. Jesus cares. That is why he commands us to love our brothers. That is how the world will know we belong to the Lord. I think it also alludes to Paul knowing these brethren. That is why I feel the apostle is so tore up by the fact that they have so soon departed from the gospel. And of course, that's sort of a reference to the Galatians as well. He says he knows that they have love for the Lord but have been misled or misunderstood how they should have dealt with his brother. Carl says, in sins of my past life, if I had let them continue to rule in my life, it would have been difficult to change later down the road. It is good to try and take care of these issues quickly before a number of people become calloused to the sin.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the other is just about the echo.
Yeah, that's a good point, Carl. It really is, and I appreciate that. It's sin. We've already stumbled when we've sinned. We shouldn't be stumbling again after the sin. Once we've repented and turned away from it, that same sin should not be causing us to stumble. And here in this case in point, it was in that, as we'll talk about this more next week, the brethren were unwilling to let up on the punishment and accept the brother the way that they should have. And so it continues to compound the problem.
It shows that a person is not just harming themselves.
That's true.
When they do these kinds of things, the man might say, "Well, what's the big deal? It's up to me if I'm lost or I'm not. I can live how I want to live, and it's just me." But his actions caused others to be, who cared about him more maybe than they even should have, to be, or in a different way than they should have, caused him to be puffed up. And so not only now was he sinning, but then by their boasting or their being puffed up about that, they were sinning. It shows the influence that and how it permeates.
Exactly right. Any other thoughts or comments, Heath? You got any other thoughts there?
No, I think you're correct in your point earlier that it's clear that whoever this person is that they've dealt with, that it has worked, and so now the issue is, are the Corinthians going to turn and respond in the way that they should?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Pardon me. Alrighty, let's see. Oh, one other thought before we start the closing rounds. Hold on just a moment. Is oftentimes we put this under the proper category of church discipline, but keep in mind, we don't wait until the church finally acts or the elders finally act for us to take a stand towards a brother who is in sin. It should really begin on the local level first, the individual level, before it's ever brought to a collective action by the local congregation. If such, then the embarrassment could be saved, kind of bringing back in Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 18. So, all right, gentlemen, let's see. Why don't we plan then, Lord willing, next Wednesday to resume with verse 7? And that'll give us an opportunity to talk about how they did not let up when they should have. Sounds like a good starting point?
Sounds good.
Okay. Kind of in the middle of everything, but a good area to resume. Well, let's see. Any final thoughts or comments this morning? Let's start with you, Heath.
Well, thanks again for having me today, and I won't be able to get in next week. I've got a family reunion next week, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you joining in at the last minute, nearly. I really appreciate you doing it, and you did a fine job. And as always, even in the various Facebook discussions that we've been involved in, I've always found your comments and your thoughts very, very helpful and very, very insightful. So I appreciate that.
I appreciate that.
Seth, any final thoughts or comments?
No, I'm just happy to be here, and if you have a Bible class this Wednesday evening, tonight, I hope that goes well, and look forward to joining everybody again next week.
Maybe I should throw the Facebook discussion. There's been some recent talk about traditions. Maybe we should talk about Wednesday night being a tradition. Move it to Thursday or Tuesday.
Where Wayne preaches down in St. Petersburg, they meet on Thursday night. So most Wednesday nights, Wayne and his family comes up and comes to Bible class with us on Wednesday nights. So we get to see each other a lot that way.
Well, that's a hard. And I'm about to use a term I shouldn't, but that's a hard habit to break in your life. If you're, it's kind of like saying if you're used to having Sunday evening services all your life, and the congregation locally says, "Hey, guess what? No more Sunday evening services." you pretty much will end up finding yourself going somewhere else on Sunday nights because it's what to you it's the way things are to be done, and you need that time with brethren. So anyway, that's for a whole nother discussion I'm intending to start with. Tom, any final thoughts or comments?
No, I think we've covered everything. Appreciate the comments as always, and look forward to continuing to deal with this. Discipline is a serious issue.
Exactly.
And dealing with both before and after is equally important. And this deals with a good situation.
But Tom, discipline will only work if the brethren are saddened by the sin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, the emotion has to be there.
Yeah, the sorrow's got to be present.
Proper emotion.
Yeah. Paul, any thoughts or comments?
We certainly missed Eric today, but appreciate Heath joining us. Thanks, Heath. Really appreciate your willingness and your good thoughts today, and just look forward to next time.
Thanks. Make sure to tell the brethren in Ellettsville I said hello.
Sounds good. And we'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this Bible study, for this discussion through the Word of God. If you have any questions or comments, maybe you hear something at a later viewing of this study that you have a question regarding, or maybe something you disagree with, don't hesitate to write us. You can contact us at our emails displayed in our lower thirds, or send them to questions@truthfactor.com. Lord willing, we'll see you back here again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That, if you're in the Eastern Time Zone, will be noon.
9 a.m. Pacific Time Zone.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.